It's my very great pleasure to be able to introduce Pamela Toler today for our session. She doesn't need much introduction. She is a neighbor, she's a member, and many of you have probably already read many of her books. I first found her on, what is it, Heroines of Mercy Street,
Yeah.
which the book is much better than the TV series. So don't, if you saw the series and you had problems with it, go read the book. It's much better. But today, Pamela will talk to us about her most recent book, Dragon from the Chicago. Just not showing it. Anyway, so please go ahead, Pamela. Tell us all about it, how you found this topic and researched it, and we'll have I'm sorry for the noise in the background. I'll turn it off in just a minute. Would you like to take questions as we go along, or shall we save them until the end?
Let's do the questions at the end, because I basically have this set up as a story, and so I'll lose my thread if we
Makes sense.
And some questions may get answered as I go. So let me start by sharing my screen, because I have learned that it's just a lot more fun if you have something to look at other than just me talking. All right, so thank you all so much for having me. I'm thrilled to have a chance to talk to you about this book. I know some of you have heard me talk about it before, but so this will be very familiar. But what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about how I found the project, tell you my favorite stories about Sigrid Schultz in the form of a story, and then I'll open up for questions at the end. So I stumbled across her story by accident. And an interesting item showed up in my newsfeed one morning. An architectural salvage vendor had found 75 glass plate photographic negatives in the attic of an old house in what's now the neighborhood of Edgewater. The images dated from the end of the 19th century, and they were unusual because that kind of negative was normally used for formal studio portraits. But these were informal pictures of, most of them, of a woman, a small child, and a large dog, and they were taken in and around the house where they were found. It was exactly the kind of historical puzzle I enjoy. So I kept reading to see if I could find out a little bit more about the pictures. It turned out that the little girl in the pictures was named Sigrid Schultz. The woman was her mother, Hedwig. And I always like to be sure we give mothers' names because all too often they get left out of the historical story. And the pictures were taken by Sigrid's father, Herman, who was a successful portrait painter who had immigrated from Norway in 1892. It was an interesting little story to read over my morning tea. It was a nice way to procrastinate starting the day's work. And then I hit the punchline. Sigrid Schultz grew up to be a groundbreaking foreign correspondent and possibly the first woman to be a foreign bureau chief for a major American newspaper. That led me straight down the rabbit hole. And it didn't take me very long to find out the broad outline of her story. Sigrid Schultz was the Chicago Tribune's Berlin bureau chief from 1925 to 1941. She was one of the first reporters to warn American audiences about just how dangerous the Nazis were. And she was one of the last to leave Berlin while it was still possible to get out. I was hooked. William Shirer, who was the author of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, he also reported from Berlin during this same period, though for a much shorter period of time than Sigrid did. And this is what he had to say about her. No other American correspondent in Berlin knew so much of what was going on behind the scenes as did Sigrid Schultz. Sigrid herself once described her career this way. She said, "I know I'm just a reporter. And what's more, I love being a reporter." I hope by the time I'm done today that you'll agree with me that she was more than just a reporter. But let's go back to Edgewater for just a moment. Sigrid was born in 1893, and she would identify herself as a Chicagoan for the rest of her life. But she really grew up in Europe. Her parents had immigrated to Chicago. They became citizens. They built a house in a neighborhood that we know as Edgewater, but then had the evocative name of Summerdale. And at the time, it was right on the city's edge. So their fenced-in garden backed up to untamed prairie. And Sigrid grew up playing rowdy games in that prairie with the neighborhood boys. She was never a girly girl, despite that hat and that dress. And the Schultzes had every intention of making Chicago their permanent home. But the market for portraits dried up when economic depression hit Chicago. And so when Hermann received an important portrait commission in Germany, he moved the family back to Europe. Sigrid wasn't happy to go. And she would have been even more unhappy if she'd known it would be 40 years before she would live in the United States again. Hermann really intended to come back to Chicago after 2 years. But one commission led to another, and each new commission meant another delay. Sigrid went to schools in both Germany and France. She often spent summers visiting her father's family in Norway, so she was accumulating language skills as she went, German and French and Norwegian, in addition to English. She graduated with honors from a renowned Parisian girls' academy in 1911. And then she attended classes informally in international law and history at the Sorbonne. Health problems stopped her from officially enrolling. At first, they thought it was tuberculosis. It actually turned out to be exhaustion. And working herself to the point of near collapse and then retreating to a health spa to recover ended up being a recurring pattern throughout her life. By 1911, she had lived in Paris longer than she had lived in Chicago. But as far as she was concerned, that was just bad luck. She was an American, and nothing could change that. More bad luck would follow in 1914. Just before World War I, Sigrid followed her parents to Berlin, where Hermann had set up a new portrait studio. And they weren't able to get out of the country when the Great War started because first her mother and then her father were too ill to travel. So Sigrid, at the age of 21, became the stranded family's sole financial support. And she would remain their sole support for the rest of her life. It wasn't easy for an American to find work in wartime Berlin. And it got even harder after the United States entered the war, because then the Schultz family were enemy aliens. But Sigrid managed. She used her language skills and her father's connections in Berlin society, and she cobbled together an income from a lot of small jobs. She would have understood the concept of the gig economy really well. She taught English and French to the children of wealthy German families. For a time, she worked as a part-time secretary at the Belgian consulate. But her favorite job, and the one that helped prepare her for her later career, was working for a Turkish diplomat named Raoul Chadirci. He had moved to Berlin because he didn't want to be caught in the Middle East if the Axis powers were defeated. And he was pretty sure they were going to be defeated. He was the mayor of Baghdad. He was also a professor of international law at the university in Baghdad. And his official reason for coming to Berlin was to study international law from the German perspective at the university there. But he didn't speak German. So he needed to hire someone who spoke both German and French and had a command of technical legal terms in both languages. It was a perfect fit for Sigrid. So she'd go to the university in the morning with a fake ID in the name of a Turkish young man, and she would take international law lectures in German. Then in the afternoon, she would go to Tchajerchi's office and she would repeat to him the content of those lectures in French. And as he grew to trust her, she also began to translate between German and French speakers in multilingual meetings in Tchajerchi's office, which became an informal education in international diplomacy in its own right. And it also introduced her to a wide range of influential men from different backgrounds. Both of those things were going to prove to be really useful. When the war ended, Sigrid probably expected that she would just continue working a lot of little odd jobs to support the family. But in the early months of the new Weimar Republic, she stumbled into what would be her lifetime career, and I would go so far as to say a lifetime passion. World War I changed the way foreign news was reported in the United States. Before the war, most American papers considered on-the-ground foreign news coverage to be an expensive luxury, and only a few papers had reporters in Europe. For the most part, they depended on the wire services for overseas news. That changed once the United States entered the war. Hundreds of American journalists made their way to Europe to report on the experiences of American soldiers in the trenches. And when the war was over, some newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune, decided that they were going to continue foreign news coverage on the ground by establishing news bureaus in major European cities. Berlin was one of those cities. This is Richard Henry Little. He was the first Berlin bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune. And he was one of the first American correspondents to arrive in Berlin after the war. He showed up directly from the battlefields of France, carrying just a musette bag and a portable typewriter. He was a veteran war correspondent. He had covered the Spanish-American War from Manila. He had covered the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 from Port Arthur. He had started reporting on the Great War from Italy as early as 1915. But he had a problem covering the news in Berlin. Like Tchajerchi, he didn't speak German. Now, he did claim to know 2 words of German, ein and Bier, which had its uses, but it meant that he was totally dependent on a translator and on local tipsters to help him find and interview sources. He was enormously frustrated by the entire process. His translators claimed they couldn't get the interviews they wanted, and he was sure they were skewing their translations to support their own political agendas. And quite frankly, in the early days of Weimar Republic, everyone had a political agenda. Soon after Little arrived in Berlin, he and Sigrid were both guests at a carnival party that the older brother of one of her students was hosting. And Sigrid didn't realize it, but she had been invited as bait. The brother who was the host was an important banker, and he and a lot of his German business friends were eager to meet some of the American reporters who were arriving in Berlin. So he sent Sigrid's student, his younger brother, to the hotels to invite correspondents to come to the party. And as an incentive to come, he promised them that they would have a chance to meet a young American woman who could give them a first-hand account in English of what it was like to be in Berlin during the war and during the revolution that founded the Weimar Republic. 2 American reporters accepted. One was Dick Little. The other was his counterpart at the Chicago Daily News. You probably would recognize his name, Ben Hecht, who later went on to become an important screenwriter. Little and Hecht didn't get the story they were promised that night, because soon after they met Sigrid, the reporters were surrounded by European guests who wanted to talk to the American journalists about political and economic conditions in the new German Republic and the creation of the Weimar Constitution, which was going on at that time, and about the German fear that Soviet Russia was going to invade from the East. The Red Scare was already a real thing in Germany at the time. But the language barrier made that conversation impossible. The American reporters didn't speak German, and even the Germans who spoke some English didn't speak it well enough to make themselves understood. And once Sigrid realized what the issue was, she basically said, "No problem, I'll translate." She had come to that party thinking that she was going to dance the night away, and she was looking forward to good food and some champagne. It was the first major social event in Berlin after the end of the war. It was a costume party, and she had come dressed in this beautiful blue gown from in the style of the late 18th century, and she had her hair all up in a pompadour. And she'd actually walked to the party through the cold and the dark because the public transportation wasn't running. And at one point, she was followed by men carrying guns, but she got there, and instead of dancing, she spent hours translating these intense discussions about politics and economics and history, going back and forth between English and German and French. That lasted literally until dawn, and she loved it. She thought it was absolutely wonderful. And a few days later, Dick Little offered Sigrid a job with the Chicago Tribune as a combination translator and cub reporter. She didn't even ask how much the job would pay. She just said yes. It felt like she'd been training for that job her whole life. She was fluent in 4 languages, competent in a 5th, and could fake her way through a number of others if she needed to. She was passionately interested in politics. She had a firm grasp of European history and culture, something that was rare among the Americans who were pouring into Europe after the war. And she had extensive connections in Berlin's artistic, political, economic, and social circles. Between her father's friends, the families of her students, and Shadirchi's contacts, she'd laid the foundation for what was going to be an extraordinary network of sources in Germany. She knew people at all levels of German society, from the baker down the street to influential businessmen, important politicians, even what she called nice white-haired old baronesses, who ended up being her link often to not only the German nobility, but the German military. Excuse me. Little took her to all his interviews because he needed her to translate. But he also took the time to teach her the fundamentals of reporting, including the importance of accuracy. He was adamant that if there weren't verifiable sources, there wasn't a story. And that wasn't a value that all of his contemporaries shared. Ben Hecht certainly didn't. It was one that Sigrid would hold to throughout her career. And she would, in fact, call out fake news on both sides of the Atlantic whenever she saw it. That was a term she actually used. Soon she was more than just a translator. She was officially the Tribune's #2 correspondent in Berlin. At the same time that she was learning how to be a journalist, she was also learning how to make a place for herself in what was really the boys' club of foreign correspondence. That was going to be a continuing balancing act throughout her career. And one of the things I was surprised that she needed to learn how to do was how to walk into a bar and order a drink. It wasn't that she was against alcohol. In fact, the Schultz household was never dry. One of the first things she learned to understand in French was a command to bring her father the corkscrew. But she grew up in a time and a place and a social class in which respectable women didn't go to bars unless they were accompanied by their father or their husband. If someone wanted to be a little loosey-goosey about it, maybe a brother or a fiance would be enough. But a boss and the rest of the foreign correspondent corps were not adequate chaperones. But she needed to be able to go to that bar. The bar in the Hotel Adlon was the unofficial clubhouse for foreign correspondents in Berlin. It was where they went to meet informants, to make contacts, to chase down rumors, to complain about their bosses back home. If she wanted to be taken seriously as a newspaper man, and that was her preferred term for herself, she needed to be in that room. But she knew she couldn't match the male reporters drink for drink. She was barely 5'2", and at the time she was still very underweight from the hungry years of the war. So she made an agreement with the bartender at the Adlon to pour her non-alcoholic drinks that looked like the real thing. If she ordered the drink called the Schultz, she got an orange juice based mocktail. If anybody else ordered a Schultz, he got orange juice with a hefty slug of whatever bottle of clear alcohol the bartender had open that day. So she was able to create the illusion that she was a hard drinking newsman, just like the rest of them. At the same time, she and her mother took a very female approach to being part of this society and turned their apartment into an alternate Berlin social hub. They threw parties. They threw beer abends, beer evenings, which was a very typical Berlin social event, but had often been a stag party before Sigrid came along and proved she could hold her beer. They threw bean parties. Mama Schultz's baked beans became famous in Berlin. And those parties were attended by seemingly everyone. German nobility, government officials, members of the diplomatic corps, artists and intellectuals of all nationalities, particularly musicians and singers. Sigrid had trained for a time as an operatic soprano in Paris, and she remained fascinated by music all her life. Their German friends came. Sigrid's fellow journalists came. In later years, she even invited some carefully selected Nazis to attend, though only after she checked to be sure that their table manners were acceptable. Because those parties weren't just about hospitality. They were also a journalistic technique. The combination of good food and plenty of alcohol convinced even Nazi officials to relax their guard. She was building contacts, something she was really good at. Dick Little was reassigned to Russia at the end of 1919. And Sigrid continued to work as a combination #2 correspondent and Girl Friday for the succession of men who worked as the Berlin bureau chief. Here she is with George Seldes, who was the second of the Berlin bureau chiefs. She used the same skills that made her such a good fit for the job to help those men navigate the complicated politics of Weimar Germany. All too often, Sigrid got the information, her boss got the byline. When she was finally promoted to Berlin bureau chief at the end of 1925, the general consensus among her peers was that it was long overdue. A journalist from the United Press office in Berlin summed up their collective opinion in his letter of congratulations. He wrote, "It's an open secret you've really been #1 for a long, long time." At a time when women reporters rarely wrote front-page stories, Sigrid regularly scooped her male counterparts on major news events, including the death of Weimar Germany's first president, Friedrich Ebert, in 1925, several months before she became bureau chief. And her Ebert scoop is a wonderful example of her ability to find an unconventional way to get the story. Ebert checked into a hospital with what he believed was the flu. It turned out to be appendicitis. The official report from the German government press office claimed there was no reason to worry about his condition, but they banned all reporters from the hospital. So there was no obvious way for her to verify just how sick Ebert was. in what she later described as a case of journalistic luck. Sigrid had a bad case of bronchitis. Her voice was gone and she was shivering with fever. So she used her illness to get herself checked into the same hospital where Ebert was. And then she spent a week in that hospital collecting information on Ebert's status. She was helped by both a friendly doctor who was actively involved and with the unknowing help of several nurses who would chatter about Ebert as they went about their work. When he died of a burst appendix, Sigrid called in the story from the hospital at a time when official sources were still releasing statements that the president was not dangerously ill. It was one more time when Sigrid got the story and her boss got the byline. It was the last time. Obviously, the Nazis were the big story of Sigrid's career, but they weren't yet a significant political power in 1925 when she became bureau chief. That changed in 1929. When the American stock market crashed, it took the German economy with it. Germany's economic freefall was a real bonanza for the Nazi Party. Its membership grew from 109,000 in 1928 to more than 1,000,000 in 1932. And Sigrid reported on their advance to power every step of the way, including a rare private interview with Hitler in 1931. In that interview, he told her he didn't need to take Germany with violence because he was successfully gaining more power with every election. Over and over in her reports, she made it clear that the Hitlerites, which is what she usually called them, that they intended to overthrow the republic once they had control of the government and to replace it with a dictatorship of what she ironically described as truly Germanic men. And in fact, as soon as Hitler was sworn in as chancellor on January 30th, 1933, the Nazis began to dismantle the rights that German citizens had enjoyed under the Weimar Republic, including freedom of the press. It only took them a few months. And foreigners living in Berlin soon realized that they were under surveillance. Their letters were being read, their telephones were being tapped. Despite constant surveillance, and despite what became regular threats of expulsion or arrest, Sigrid reported accurately on the actions of Hitler and the Nazi regime, often sharing stories no one else was telling. She told her readers about laws attacking the rights of German Jews and about growing violence against German Jewish businesses. She reported on the opening of concentration camps. Her first reference appeared in an article dated March 21st, 1933, only 2 months after he took power. And that reference was tucked into the middle of a relatively innocuous article. It's a sandwich technique that was one of her favorite ways of getting dangerous news out. You'd have a little bit of the innocuous story, you'd have the hard stuff in the middle, you'd have the end of the innocuous story. That technique worked on the assumption that most people don't read past the first couple of paragraphs, so that there was less chance of the dangerous news being noticed by German authorities. It didn't always work. She got her first summons to the Gestapo on June 11th, 1933, again, only months after Hitler came to power. When I first read her account of that event, I was sitting in the archival reading room at Northwestern's library, and I realized I was holding my breath as I read. I mean, I knew everything turned out okay for her. I already knew how the story ended, but I read that account with the historical knowledge of just how bad things could have been. She went in innocently believing that she was safe because everything she reported was true and accurate. She thought she was going to be called out because she had been writing some hard-hitting articles about the Enabling Acts, which were a series of laws that the Nazis had managed to put through the Reichstag that allowed Hitler to rule by decree, basically making the Reichstag irrelevant. Instead, she just got a slap on the wrist for a relatively minor article. But what she did get was the first of many warnings and her real first hint that the truth was no longer a shield she could count on. Despite the warnings and repeated visits to the Gestapo, she reported on every major event that occurred in Nazi Germany. More than once she was threatened with expulsion. And, this picture doesn't actually have anything to do with that threat, but I can only stand to look at a picture of Nazis for so long. I think you might feel the same way. And this is one of my favorite pictures of her, where she's just stepping out with energy on the streets of Berlin. At one point, the Germans tried to frame her as a spy. And they did it by delivering what looked like secret military documents to her apartment. Now, luckily, her mother immediately called her at the office and told her that this package had arrived. Sigrid hurried home, and she found that, in fact, the package contained what looked like plans for a new airplane engine. And she knew she would be arrested if she were caught with it in her possession. And she was afraid she didn't have much time until the Gestapo would get there. So she shoved the pages and the package they came in into the fireplace, stayed until it had burned down to ashes. On her way back to the office, she ran into a German who she had long suspected of trying to entrap unwary journalists with exactly that kind of material. He was clearly headed toward their apartment. He was accompanied by what she described as two shady figures. She just stepped right in his path and told him, don't even waste his time. There was nothing left. She destroyed everything. There was nothing for him to find. A few days later, she was at a lunch with the Foreign Press Club. And the guest of honor was Hermann Goering, who was Hitler's right-hand man and was the architect of these attempts to discredit foreign journalists as spies. She publicly confronted Goering about the attempts in front of the entire press club. She told him, you might as well stop. Nobody's stupid enough to print these stories. And Goering just lost it and snapped back, you'll never learn to show proper respect for state authorities. I suppose that's one of the characteristics of people from that crime-ridden city of Chicago. Thereafter, he and his staff called her that dragon from Chicago, and she owned the title with pride. Her fearless reporting brought danger with it for both Sigrid and her informants. There'd always been stories that she wouldn't share for publication because she didn't have the evidence to support them. Now there were stories she felt she couldn't share for publication because they would endanger her informants. And even so, one of her most trusted informants suffered 3 Nazi-contrived car accidents in a very short period of time. But he still continued to bring her stories despite the danger. She found ways to cope with the tightening controls over the press. And one of the most important was that she created a pseudonym so that she could write about particularly dangerous topics without fear. And she came up with the idea in 1936. The Chicago office sent her a request to write an in-depth article about what was known as the Night of the Long Knives. That was Hitler's violent purge of both the stormtrooper leadership and also other people who he saw as political rivals. And it had happened 2 years before, in June of 1934. The Chicago office sent that letter to the Paris office. And Paris wasn't yet under Nazi control. People in that office didn't have sort of the in-the-bone sense of how dangerous things were in Berlin. So first, the secretary at the Paris office called Sigrid to give her the instructions, with just no sense that the Berlin office phones were being tapped and were probably being recorded. Then the head of the Paris bureau made it worse by forwarding the letter to Sigrid at home. When she got it, she knew the Germans had read it because not only was it open, but it had German censor stamps on the envelope. It was going to be a dangerous story to write, but she really wanted to write it. It was a month after the Berlin Olympics of 1936 had ended, and a lot of Americans had come back from that event really impressed with Germany. The Germans had very consciously turned Berlin into a welcoming place. So Americans were coming back and saying, it was clean, it was orderly, everything was so well organized, people were polite and friendly. We think these reporters are crazy. The Nazis just aren't that bad. So Sigrid really wanted to write this article about a very dark moment in the Nazi history so that it would counteract this sense that the Nazis weren't that bad. So the first thing she did was take advantage of the fact that she knew her stuff was being watched. And she told the Chicago office that she couldn't write the article. There was nothing new to say. She had already said everything she had to say in the 12 articles that she'd written 2 years earlier. Then she went to Paris, where she could safely write the article. And when she sent the article to Chicago from Paris, she suggested the Tribune publish it under someone else's name so that she could give the Tribune readers what she called all the dope there is without fear of retribution. The name she chose was John Dixon, which was a sly tribute to Dick Little, whom she always described as her father in journalism, making her Dick's son. She used that name well into 1940, while at the same time she was writing plenty of other articles that upset the Nazis under her own byline. She added a relatively new title to her resume during the Munich conference in September 1938. At that point, in addition to a foreign correspondent, she became a broadcast journalist. Radio was still relatively new at the time, and the first overseas news broadcast had occurred immediately after the Austrian Anschluss several months earlier in March. The mutual broadcasting system hired Sigrid as a stringer. They were a relatively new network. They were a cooperative network that was owned by member radio stations, including WGN, which was a Tribune affiliate. And since they were so new, they didn't have their own reporters on the ground. They used stringers like Sigrid. And she made her first broadcast for Mutual at midnight Munich time, September 29th. And it was at midnight so that her report would reach American listeners at the dinner hour. The announcer introduced her segment in this really plummy voice. It was really a lot of exaggerated vowels and almost a condescending tone. And then there was just this long silence. And then listeners heard the sound of rustling paper. And finally, Sigrid began to speak, and her voice was a really sharp contrast to the announcers. Her tones were really clipped. Imagine something halfway between Eleanor Roosevelt and Julia Child. And she greeted her audience with what was going to become her standard opening. This is Sigrid Schultz, the Berlin correspondent of the Chicago Tribune. And she said she really hoped that she was going to be able to give her listeners a clear picture of the international situation that night, but it was impossible because the representatives of the four powers at the conference were back in a closed meeting, even as she spoke. But she had airtime to fill. So with no news to report, she broadcast a combination of satirical commentary on the four great powers and their differences in style and what they were hoping to accomplish. And then she ended with the insightful political analysis that she was known for. She was back in the studio 2.5 hours later with breaking news. She had a heavily censored script this time. They weren't taking any chances. She reported that the four powers had signed an agreement ordering Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland. It was real news in real time. And that was as new for the listeners as it was for Sigrid. By January of the following year, she was a regular on the air with a 15-minute lineup of news and analysis that ran on Sunday evenings live from Berlin. Throughout 1938, as war appeared inevitable, Sigrid accurately predicted Hitler's military intentions. She reported on the Austrian Anschluss. She traveled alongside German troops when they marched into the Sudetenland on October 1st, 1938. She forecast the German-Soviet non-aggression pact 5 weeks before it was signed. It was the most important scoop of her career. That pact was the last political piece that Hitler needed before he was comfortable marching into Poland. And at 4:30 in the morning, September 1st, 1939, Sigrid sat in the Kroll Opera House across the plaza from the burned out remains of the Reichstag building and listened as Hitler announced to a hastily called session of the Reichstag that the war with Poland had begun. With Germany's invasion of Poland, Sigrid took on the role, but not the title of war correspondent. Her first article in the outbreak of the war reached the Tribune an hour before the Nazis crossed the border. And throughout September, she produced a steady stream of front-page articles for the Tribune about the Nazi advance and its consequences for the people of both Poland and Germany. But as the war went on, it became harder and more dangerous to get the news out of Germany. She'd long assumed that her telephone was tapped. Now she had reason to believe that her maid was reporting on everything that happened in her apartment. Her German friends and acquaintances were being cross-examined about her. Her network of informants began to disappear. She found ways around the roadblocks. When the German press office delayed transmitting her articles for hours at a time, she set up a telephone line from Berlin to Copenhagen and then paid a secretary there to wire her articles to the United States. When the German army didn't let her join mail reporters on press junkets to the front, she hired a young journalist named John Riley to be her eyes and ears, and then supplemented his reports by going to a train station in East Berlin and eavesdropping on German soldiers as they came and went from the front. It was actually a much more reliable source of war news than the Nazi press releases. By 1940, it was almost impossible for foreign correspondents to report the news with any integrity. For the first time, Sigrid seriously feared for her safety. She left Germany at the end of January 1941, expecting to return to Europe in only a few months to report from one of the neutral countries, if not from Germany itself. Instead, due to a combination of serious illness, bad luck, and the United States entering the war, it was 1945 before Sigrid finally returned to Europe, this time as an accredited war correspondent for both McCall's magazine and the Chicago Tribune. Sigrid's most powerful war reporting was her work on the death camps, and then later on the war crimes trials of Dachau and Bergen-Belsen. She was one of the first correspondents to enter the Buchenwald concentration camp, part of a group that got there only hours after the American troops had liberated it. I don't have to tell you that experience was harrowing. I am sure you're familiar with many of the details about the camps. But Sigrid experienced Buchenwald in a very different way from her fellow correspondents that day, because of her ability to speak to the former prisoners in their own language. Once one of the prisoners heard her speaking French, he asked if she would speak to a group of French prisoners who were held in a barracks apart from the others. They were dying, and the prisoner thought it would be good if they could hear that the camp had been liberated in their own language. Sigrid went to the barracks, She later said it was the most gruesome thing she had ever seen. There were 3 tiers of bunks, and blood and other fluids were dripping from the men on the top bunks down onto the men below them. There was nothing she could do to make them more comfortable. All she could do was call out to them over and over again in French, "You are free." After a while, she added, "I've just come from Paris. The chestnuts are in bloom in Paris." One man sat halfway up and stretched out a hand toward her. She took it. "Is it really true?" he asked. "It's really true. You're free. The American planes are coming." "The chestnuts are in bloom?" he asked. She nodded yes, and then he was gone. Sigrid's career as a foreign correspondent ended soon after the Nuremberg trials began. She was back home on a speaking tour, and she stopped to talk to the paper's owner, Colonel McCormick, which she did whenever she was in Chicago. And while they were discussing the war crimes trials, McCormick said, "We have officers who should also be put on trial." And Sigrid was just stunned and answered, "Colonel, I'm sorry, I just can't go along with that." They changed the topic. They continued their conversation. But when she left his office, she walked down the stairs to the managing editor, by her own account, weeping her head off, and immediately resigned. She probably could have landed a job as a foreign correspondent with one of the Tribune's competitors, but she was 53 years old, which was a lot older then than it is now. She was in poor health, and she was an only child with an elderly mother to care for. So she tried to find work for herself in the United States as a freelance journalist and Central European specialist. For 10 years after the war, Sigrid made regular reporting trips to Germany and Eastern Europe on behalf of major national magazines. Because she was a recognized expert on German affairs, she made appearances on radio and later on television whenever a host wanted to explain what was happening in Germany to an American audience. But she never quite made the transition to reporting in the post-war world. Her language skills and the personal networks that had served her so well in Berlin really had little value for a reporter in the United States. And more importantly, the fact that she just couldn't get her head around the fact that Russia was now the big bad in US foreign policy, not Germany. That made her a political dinosaur. Sigrid lived the last years of her life in Westport, Connecticut, in the 240-year-old cottage she had purchased for her mother in 1938. She was surrounded by cats, stacks of unfiled documents, and half-written articles, memoirs, and histories. In her last years, she was so fragile that she was confined to a wheelchair. But she wasn't too fragile to keep a bottle of champagne in the refrigerator in case guests dropped by. And whenever I look at this picture, I like to think she's got champagne in that cup, not tea. But even though she had disappeared for the most part from public view, she was never entirely forgotten. In the 1970s, a younger generation of journalists and scholars sought her out to ask about working with Colonel McCormick, about her days in Berlin, about the rise of the Nazis, or about her experiences as a woman foreign correspondent. They were consistently able to look beyond the clutter of the cats, and it's got to be said, the dirt, and instead see her charm, her intelligence, and the force of her personality. At the end of an interview a few years before her death in 1980, Schultz said, "Talking to you really makes me feel a little bit more alive." Her interviewer's answer, "I didn't see how anyone could be more alive than you are, Sigrid." Thank you all for listening. And I am happy to open up for questions now. I can figure out how to stop sharing. There we go.
Okay, thank you so very much. Okay, my first question is, how much trouble did you have finding sources for this book?
You
Does-
know, there were an astonishing amount of sources. The Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison had Sigrid's papers, and she was a real pack rat. So they had like 75 boxes of stuff, letters and little notebooks that she kept daily notes in, and drafts of articles and draft memoirs and astrology charts that she had kept, but also the Tribune's archives at Northwestern had letters from her and about her. So I was able to get things that wouldn't show up in the paper, for instance. McCormick wanted his foreign correspondents to send him weekly reports about what was happening on the ground. So in those reports, I found things that were never in the paper. And then I also had her newspaper articles. I literally read every bylined article she had in chronological order, which was a chilling and fascinating introduction to Nazi Germany. Rita, you had a question.
Yeah, it's following up on that. I was just wondering how her papers ended up in Wisconsin. It's curious to me, why they didn't end up somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Chicago.
Well, they didn't end up in Europe because she brought everything she could back
Yeah.
with her.
Or in
Um,
Connecticut, even, even
Right.
Connecticut.
Well, and they ended up in Madison because the Wisconsin Historical Society asked for them. Was
Ah,
that simple. They were trying to put together a center for Midwestern journalists.
ah,
So they simply were the first people to ask.
interesting. Ah,
And I think there was a question down here in the chat. How does the book compare to or contrast with In the Garden of the Beasts? Well, first, I'm not Eric Larson. So to that extent, he is a master storyteller, and I aspire to be as good at it as Eric Larson. But he looks at it from a very different perspective. His book deals with a shorter period of time, and it deals with the experiences of what was actually a Chicago family. The father was the ambassador to Germany during the early years of the Nazis. Sigrid actually appears in that book a number of times. She makes a few cameo appearances. So they are companion volumes in some way, two different ways of looking at the same story from slightly different angles and on a different scale. So different but similar. Anyone else?
Well, I just want to mention that Seminary Co-op had featured this in their last newsletter, and they do have a few copies of the book on hand. So run on over to the Seminary Co-op. They were considering joining us today, but couldn't fit it into their schedule. But they're open.
They're open, yes. Renata, you're muted. You're muted, so we can't hear you. If you click the place that says your if you click your
mute button.
mute button, it should let us hear you.
Or
There you
maybe,
go.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm going down to get the book. This articulates with my own experience, born in Germany in 32, and I will how my parents until 39, 40 lived there and how they made their peace with the things that you know about. So I'm very definitely a buyer and will hope to comment about it. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, Pam, I know you're an historian, not a prognosticator, but I can't help but draw some similarities between the situation she describes and the situation we're facing with the Trump administration. But do you have some advice for journalists? I wonder if we will have some journalists who step forward to
I certainly
record
hope
and let folks know what's going on.
you know, the thing that I really came away from writing this book was the sense that democracy is fragile and that one of the most important weapons for defending democracy is an engaged press and engaged readers of that press, because
Yeah.
an enormous number of people read the reports from Germany and said, I don't believe it. It can't possibly be true. So, taking the time to be an informed reader of a press is critical.
Yeah.
Realize that is not a lot of help, but it's all I've got. Anyone else?
Well, that exact, well, one of the things that I keep reading is that people in Germany during the 30s supported Hitler because they thought they could control him and use him to achieve their own agendas. And I'm wondering if, that's perhaps going on in our own country. But how much of that did you see in your work with and research about
Oh,
Sig-
absolutely. It was absolutely clear that people thought they could control him. And they failed, obviously. And some of those people didn't survive thinking they could control him.
We notice how many billionaires are currently getting involved in politics. Was that the same in Germany? Were Hitler's supporters the upper echelon in financials, or
He had supporters at all levels of society.
all levels?
All levels of society. That just Germany suffered after the war. It suffered
Right.
badly after the war, and it's suffered badly. I mean, it had already suffered after the war, and then the Depression hit, and it was horrible. And people who had counted on the various socialist parties as their defense against those things turned to the Nazis because the Nazis said they would help. You can
They'd lower the price of eggs, right?
Yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Hello, this is Cecilia Hubbard, and my family went through the Japanese 36 years of occupation in Korea when I was, and I was born in 1948 after the World War II ended. However, what I would like to know is what's the complicity of Vatican during this time, particularly these German and Nazis and whole the European this superiority complex and the Russian indifference and this communism was percolating and arising. And could you just make a comment on that? Appreciate it.
Sure. That's a huge question. I will do my best. First, Russia was not in good shape either. For much of this period, there were the Russian civil wars going on. And at least in the late days of the Weimar Republic, there were German politicians who were attempting to stir up the Civil War. They were supporting the communists, hoping that it would weaken the Eastern Front, but they were also cold-bloodedly prepared to pull the anti-Semitism card in Russia to basically lead the Russian people to rise up against the communists. So at first, Russia really isn't a player because Russia is in total disarray, is part of that. The Vatican was complicit, and then and they weren't the only ones who were complicit. There were an awful lot of people who were either supporting the Nazis or not speaking up against them. I mean, England and France did nobody any favors at Munich. The world was complicit, is the bottom line. How's that for an uplifting thought?
So, well, we are going over our time, and I don't want to keep you too long. So unless there are other questions, anyone else? I mean, we know how to reach you, so if we have questions, follow up.
I
But
just want to say it was a wonderful book. I could
Yeah.
not put it down. It
Oh,
was
thank
just
you.
great.
and a
Thank you.
wonderful talk. I thank you very much.
Yes, marvelous.
Can
And-
I ask,
and
how are
Bella's
book
just-
sales going? I mean,
It-
this is the kind of book I would like a lot of people to read.
Oh, yes.
Well, I don't really know yet because the way reports come to writers, you get
Yeah.
them long after the fact, but I know my publisher is happy. So
Okay.
Oh,
that's
that's good.
That's good.
that's all
That's
that's all I've got on
Okay.
that, but
Yeah, well, thank you so very
Thank you.
much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Pam.
much.
Very good.
Yeah.
well, thank you all for having me here.
Thank you.
Come back more often.
Bye-bye.